Welcome to episode 8 of Retrieving Reason podcast. I'm Dr. Kelly Fitzsimmons Burton, and our topic this week is the formative use of reason. This will be one of several uses of reason or reasoning that we'll be discussing over the next few weeks. Last week, we defined reason in itself as the laws of thought. Remember, we gave a definition. Reason in itself is the laws of thought. And we talked about the 3 laws. Today, we want to begin to discuss how those laws are used. So we'll go from reason in itself. And we said that reason in itself is not fallible. It's not fallen. It's a series of laws. And we'll go from those laws to the use of reason. And this is where fallibility comes in. We are human, we're fallible, we make mistakes in reasoning. And this is why we need to be taught to think critically. So as we talk about reasoning or reason in its use, I want to make a distinction between reasoning and non-reasoning, which could be we're not thinking, or partial reasoning, or bad reasoning. If you remember, we did go over these in the episode 3 on proto-epistemology. So we need to add something into this section on reason in its use. And the thing I want to add is a distinction between the descriptive use of reason, what all human beings do when they reason, and the normative use of reason, which has an ethical component to it, what we ought to do. So we want to make a distinction between what we do and what we ought to do. So when we get to the normative aspect of the use of reason, this is where we want to apply the carefulness criterion. Remember, we had a conversation about that. This is where we need to be careful in our reasoning so that we are sure we're not making mistakes or errors in our reasoning. All right, so let's jump into discussing the formative use of reason. And I'm going to say the formative use of reason is both descriptive, this is what we do, and it has a normative aspect. We need to be careful in this area. We ought to be careful. We ought to use reason well here. Use it well, okay? So we're using the laws of thought now. And the formative use of reason is that we use reason to form concepts, judgments, and arguments. And these are the forms of all thought. So if we're thinking, we are using concepts, we are making judgments, we are forming arguments, and that's what thinking is. So think about that, thinking and non-thinking. So let's talk about each of those components. Using reason to form concepts. Concepts are where the mind grasps the essential nature of a thing. We grasp what a thing is, and we distinguish its essential features from its accidental features. So here you can see this is reason in its use, identifying what a thing is and distinguishing it from what it is not. So reason is used to form concepts. Concepts grasp the essential nature of a thing, and we express concepts through words, terms, or symbols. This is what you would learn about in a logic class. So concepts are evaluated in terms of their meaningfulness. So we either grasp a concept well or we grasp it not very well. So they're more or less meaningful to us, okay? So the concept is where we understand the thing. So concepts have to do with meaning. We understand the meaning of the thing. Now, this is contrasted with images, what we see of a thing. So think about the difference between the concept cup and the image of seeing a cup. I was looking over here to see if I have a cup. I don't have a cup. But think about the distinction between the concept pencil and now this image of this pencil, okay? Concept is not an image. Concept is not a feeling. not all things we do are thinking. We also have feelings, but concepts and feelings are different. Concepts are not association. Sometimes we associate this with this, like I associate onions with yucky taste. I don't like them. So I have an association, but that's not a concept. I have a concept of onions, but that's different than my association of onions with yuck. A concept is not the same as percept, or something we're perceiving. So we perceive what comes in through our senses. That's not the same as conceiving. So perceiving and conceiving are different. And a concept is not the same as order or orderly behavior. So we may see a lot of different order in the world. Maybe the order in the computer, the order in artificial intelligence, the order in parts of our body. Our heart is orderly. Order in nature, like bees and the colony of bees in the hive and what they do. There's a lot of order there. Animals could do orderly behavior, but this order is not the same as concept or conceptualization. So we want to make those distinctions. Notice we're conceiving of concepts. We're getting the concept of concept in place. This is important because it's the first act of reason. It's the first application of reason. And if we make mistakes at the level of concept, then we could make mistakes all down the line, because judgments will build upon concepts and arguments will build upon judgments and concepts. So this is where we want to be particularly careful. This is where we ought to be careful. So we use words, and words have meaning, and we need to make sure we agree on the terms that we're using when we use them together, to be sure we understand the meaning that we're trying to convey to one another. All right, concepts are the category, are evaluated by the category of meaning. So we could have meaning or something other than meaning. And I mentioned images, feeling, association, percept, order. Those are not the same as concept. Okay, I'm spending a lot of time on concepts, but it's because it's important. Okay, judgments are the next level of the use of reason, the formative use of reason. We make judgments. Judgments are unavoidable. We say the pencil is on the table. Anytime we join a subject and a predicate term with affirmation or negation, like is or is not, we make a judgment. Sometimes we're trained to think judgments are bad, but they're not. Judgments are unavoidable. It's a use of reason. So onions, maybe this is not a judgment, and maybe this is a matter of taste, which is another level we can talk about. Onions are evil. It's a judgment, right? I think that's probably a matter of taste. How about today is Saturday? The good is knowledge. Those are judgments. And the way we evaluate judgments are by true and false. And we could use the square of opposition in a logic class to test judgments for true, false, or sometimes doubtful. So we evaluate judgments on the level of truth. A judgment, such as the good is knowledge, is a proposition that should match reality. So if this judgment, the proposition, the good is knowledge, if that is true, then the good would actually be knowledge in reality. If I make the judgment today is Saturday, then reality is such that it is Saturday. Okay. Now judgments are either true or false, and we ought to aim for true judgments. Okay, we ought to aim for truth. This is the normative aspect of this use of reason. We do make judgments. That's the descriptive level. We ought to make true judgments. So truth is distinguished from false or falsehood. Is distinguished from taste, which I gave you. Onions are evil is not a true or false statement. It's a matter of taste. We don't have to argue about those kinds of things. And it's different than opinions. Sometimes we express judgments that are just our opinion and we have no good reason for them. We just maybe feel a certain way. We have a certain opinion and we're not sure why. So judgments should be true. And when we make them, we should expect someone to say, why do you think that? And we should be ready to give them a reason for why we think that. So judgments can be backed up by the third application of the formative use of reason, and that's in giving arguments. Concepts first, and they're meaningful or not. Judgments are true or false. Arguments have to do with the structure of an argument. I'll give you an example. And the content. So an argument uses premises to logically support a conclusion. And the premises are judgments. Here's an example. You've probably heard this one. All men are mortal. So notice this. Men, human beings, are mortal. They die. Socrates is a man. Premise 2. Therefore, what's the conclusion? Socrates is mortal. So notice these are premises supporting a conclusion. So a judgment is a conclusion, and we should be able to give premises that support our judgments. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Anytime we make a judgment, we should be able to support it with an argument. Now, I mentioned validity. An argument has a certain form, and this is, again, what you would study in a logic class. You can test the form to see if the premises actually do logically support the conclusion. You can replace the words for letters and test the structure of the argument. You could also test the content. So is it true that all men are mortal? Is it true that everybody dies? Well, to the best of our knowledge, we know that, yeah. Socrates is a man, yes. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, yes. And we know the story of Socrates. So we know that this is a sound argument. It's valid and the premises are true. So the conclusion is a necessary truth. And since the conclusion is necessarily true, that gives us knowledge. So arguments are the means for attaining knowledge. And that's what we want. Knowledge is good, right? So we have concepts give us meaning, judgments give us truth, arguments should give us knowledge. Now, what are arguments contrasted with? Incidentally, I want to back up and say we ought to give each other arguments for the judgments that we make. Otherwise, we're just stuck in opinions and matters of taste. And disagreements that will never resolve. So arguments give us knowledge, and knowledge is contrasted with, or arguments are contrasted with, fake arguments or informal fallacies. Informal fallacies are pseudo-arguments. Oftentimes we think we're providing an argument and we're not. It's a fake argument, and we can study that in a logic class and see what the fake arguments are and not use them because they don't give knowledge. They will just get us more skepticism. Remember, skepticism says we can't know. So the informal fallacies are not arguments. They're fake arguments. Rationalizations are not arguments. Oftentimes we try to provide self-justification rather than actual justification. We give lame excuses rather than a real argument. So rationalizations are not reasons. Okay, so we don't want to get stuck in, reasoning is rationalization. No, those are different things. Knowledge or arguments are not power. Some people are going to say knowledge is just power struggles. That's not true. Although an argument does have a force, it has a kind of power. If you remember the argument I just gave you, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. There's a force to the argument. Your mind is forced to the conclusion because of the way the structure of the argument is and the content. So there is a power to argument, but it's not the same as a power struggle or reason used to gain dominance. There are some postmodern philosophers that will make that claim, that knowledge is just a power struggle. No, knowledge is knowledge. Power is power. Those aren't the same thing. Knowledge is not the same as emotion, and an argument is not the same as emotion. Some people argue with passion, but that's not the same thing. And an emotional appeal is probably an informal fallacy. Some people talk about ethos, logos, pathos, that when you're trying to make a case for a position, let's say you want to persuade people to believe, you need emotion, you need passion. I think that's probably true, but don't confuse logos, which is the argument, with the pathos, which is the passion with which you deliver your argument. Those aren't the same thing. And lastly, some people want to say that we have to just go with what works. So we can't really know. We can't really provide arguments. It hasn't been successful in the past, so we just need to be pragmatic and go with what works. Knowledge is not the same as pragmatism, as some philosophers have tried to argue, like William James. Knowledge is what works, what gets the job done. That's not true either. So I want to contrast arguments which give us knowledge with informal fallacies, rationalizations, power, emotion, and pragmatism. Those are not knowledge, and those are often confused with knowledge, and knowledge is gained by arguments. All right, so I want to pause here and sum up what we talked about today. We talked about the formative use of reason, which has a descriptive and a normative aspect. In the descriptive aspect, human beings form concepts, judgments, and arguments. It's how we think, it's how we communicate with one another. We do it. The normative aspect is we ought to do it well. We need to be careful, apply the carefulness criterion here, and form concepts that actually are meaningful and get to what is, provide judgments, give judgments that are true, and provide arguments that support our true judgments, that prove that our judgments are true, and that will give us knowledge. So notice we're looking for meaning, truth, knowledge. And if we use reason, the formative use of reason well, we're reasoning well in this aspect, we should expect to arrive at knowledge. Okay, this is where I want to pause for today. Where we're going next time is the critical use of reason. And this is also going to have a normative aspect to it. The critical use of reason is what we often mean by critical thinking. It's a test for meaning. It's when we read something, hear something, say something, we pause and say, what does that mean? And we try to understand it. So it's going to be a continuation of reasoning, critical thinking. Okay, thank you for listening. Thanks for sticking in there with me. Today, we talked about the formative use of reason. Don't forget to tune in next week, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.